The rain pounded against the windshield, turning the narrow road into a shimmering, treacherous path. The wipers moved back and forth in a rhythmic struggle to keep the glass clear, but visibility was still poor. David tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening under the pressure. The storm was relentless, but it wasn't the weather that made his heart pound. It was the conversation happening in the back seat. Jackson Harrington sat with his legs crossed, his posture as rigid as the tailored suit he wore. Next to him, July Harrington sipped delicately from a glass of wine, seemingly unbothered by the storm outside. Their voices were calm, measured, but David heard the weight in their words. "This situation is becoming unbearable," Jackson muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. "The creditors are circling, and our reputation is hanging by a thread." "We still have a way out," July replied smoothly, adjusting the diamond bracelet on her wrist. "Hannah is our last chance." David kept his eyes on the road, but his ears caught every word. His pulse quickened. "She's still resisting, Jackson. She doesn't understand what's at stake. She thinks she has the luxury of choice." July's voice held a sharp edge. Jackson let out a heavy sigh. "She has no choice. She will marry Harold Montgomery. That old fool is desperate for a trophy wife, and his wealth will solve all our problems." David felt his jaw clench. His fingers twitched against the leather steering wheel, resisting the urge to react. He had suspected they were using Hannah, but hearing them discuss it so callously made his blood boil. July swirled the wine in her glass, watching the crimson liquid dance. "She's always been headstrong, but she's still our daughter. She'll do what's best for this family in the end." Jackson scoffed. "Not if she finds out the truth. If she knew how bad things really were, she'd cut ties with us completely. That's why we must be careful." David forced himself to remain composed. This was why he was here. He had come into their lives as a mere chauffeur, a shadow in the background, unnoticed and underestimated. But he wasn't just here to listen. He was here to uncover the truth. The storm outside intensified, the wind howling through the trees. The mansion loomed in the distance, its grand silhouette barely visible through the downpour. As they approached the estate, David exhaled slowly, forcing his heartbeat to steady. Tonight was just the beginning. David pulled the sleek black sedan up to the grand entrance of the Harrington estate. The rain continued its assault, hammering against the roof of the car as if urging him to act, to do something. But he couldn't. Not yet. He had to remain invisible, just a chauffeur, nothing more. Stepping out into the storm, he quickly retrieved a large black umbrella from the trunk and walked around to open the rear door. Jackson was the first to emerge, straightening his jacket before stepping onto the polished stone driveway. July followed with her usual grace, her movements deliberate, as if the world revolved around her pace. She took the umbrella from David without acknowledgement, barely sparing him a glance. David clenched his jaw but kept his posture neutral. He knew how people like them worked. If he showed even a flicker of defiance, they would suspect something. He had spent years studying the elite, understanding their mannerisms, their sense of entitlement. It was what made this disguise so effective. They didn't see him. To them, he was just another nameless employee. July glanced back at the car. "Leave the engine running," she said flatly. "Hannah should be arriving soon." David gave a curt nod. "Yes, ma'am." She and Jackson ascended the grand staircase leading to the massive double doors of the estate. The butler, an older man with a stiff posture, opened the doors for them without a word. The doors swung shut behind them, sealing David out in the cold, wet night. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his damp hair. His pulse was still racing from what he had overheard in the car. Jackson and July weren't just controlling, they were ruthless. They were willing to sell off their own daughter to the highest bidder to maintain their status. And Hannah, she had no idea. David leaned against the side of the car, eyes narrowing at the mansion's imposing facade. He had met Hannah months ago at a charity event in New York. She was nothing like her parents. She had been warm, sincere, completely unaware of the web of deception that surrounded her. That was why he had fallen for her, and that was why he had to protect her. Headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the rain as another car approached the estate. David straightened, rolling his shoulders as he prepared for the next part of his act. Hannah had arrived. The sleek silver car came to a stop beside his, and the back door opened. Hannah stepped out, shielding herself against the rain with a navy trench coat. Even with her hair slightly damp and the storm raging around her, she carried herself with effortless elegance. But there was something else, an exhaustion in her posture, a tension in her eyes that David hadn't seen before. She paused, glancing at him briefly, before turning her gaze toward the mansion. "They're waiting for me, aren't they?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. David hesitated for only a second before responding, keeping his tone professional. "Yes, Mum." She let out a soft laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Of course they are." David wanted to say something, anything, but he knew he couldn't. Not yet. Instead, he simply followed her as she walked toward the entrance, watching as the butler opened the door for her. The moment she stepped inside, the doors shut behind her, locking her in. David exhaled, the weight of everything settling on his shoulders. Tonight, she would be bombarded with her parents' manipulations. Tonight, they would try to convince her that marrying Harold Montgomery was her duty, her obligation. But David had a plan. And before this was over, Hannah would know the truth. This was just the beginning. The rain had finally eased into a light drizzle by the time David parked the car in the estate's side lot. The storm had passed, but the tension lingering in the air was far from over. From his position, he could see the faint glow of the chandelier filtering through the mansion's high windows. He imagined Hannah inside, standing in the grand parlor, facing her parents as they weaved their usual web of manipulation. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. Jackson and July Harrington had built a life of illusions, polished appearances, rehearsed charm, and power plays disguised as family values. But tonight, he had seen something different in Hannah. The way she hesitated before stepping inside, the exhaustion in her voice, the realization that perhaps she was finally beginning to see the cracks in her family's perfect facade. David reached into the glove compartment and retrieved his phone. A message from Nathan lit up the screen. "Nathan, anything new?" David exhaled before typing back. "David, they're pushing harder than I thought. It's worse than we assumed. They want her married off as soon as possible." There was a short pause before Nathan responded. "Nathan, you need to get her out of there before it's too late." David clenched his jaw. He knew that. But Hannah wasn't some helpless pawn he could simply remove from the board. She needed to see the truth for herself. She needed to be the one to choose to walk away. A movement near the front gate caught his eye. A sleek black car rolled to a stop, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out. Even from a distance, David recognized him instantly. Harold Montgomery, the man Jackson and July had chosen for Hannah. David felt a bitter taste in his mouth. Harold adjusted his tailored jacket before striding toward the entrance, his confidence unwavering. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. And tonight, it was clear what he was after. Hannah. David's grip on the phone tightened, his pulse drumming in his ears. He needed to be inside that house. He needed to hear what was being said. Taking a steadying breath, he pulled open the car door and stepped out, adjusting the brim of his cap. The role of the silent chauffeur wasn't glamorous, but it had its advantages. And tonight, he was going to use every single one of them. David strode toward the side entrance of the estate, keeping his posture neutral as he passed by a few house staff members who barely acknowledged him. That was the benefit of playing the invisible role. No one paid much attention to the help. He slipped inside through the kitchen, the scent of roasted lamb and red wine filling the air. The chefs and servers bustled about, too busy preparing for whatever grand dinner the Harringtons had planned to notice him. He moved swiftly, weaving through the corridors until he reached the edge of the main hall. From there, he had a clear view of the grand parlour, where Jackson and July sat poised like royalty, glasses of aged scotch in hand. And standing between them, looking every bit like a caged bird, was Hannah. Her expression was unreadable, but David could see the tension in her shoulders. The moment she had stepped into that room, she had walked into a carefully orchestrated battle, one she likely didn't even realize she was fighting. And then there was Harold Montgomery. He sat across from Hannah, legs crossed, his eyes scanning her as if she were an acquisition, something to be acquired rather than someone to be loved. The confidence in his demeanor wasn't just arrogance, it was certainty. He believed this was a done deal. David's stomach twisted. "Hannah, darling," July purred, swirling the amber liquid in her glass. "We were just talking about how perfect the timing is. Harold has been incredibly patient, and he's made it clear how deeply he values you." Hannah's lips pressed into a thin line. "Values me?" she repeated, her voice measured. "Like an investment." Jackson exhaled sharply. "That's not what your mother meant?" "But it's what she implied," Hannah countered, her gaze flicking toward Harold. "I think we should be clear about what's happening here." Harold chuckled, leaning forward slightly. "I won't pretend I don't know what's at stake," he admitted, his voice smooth, practiced. "But let's not reduce this to something so transactional. I think we'd make a good match, Hannah. Your parents know it, and I think deep down you do too." David could see Hannah's hands curling into fists at her sides. He wasn't sure whether it was from frustration or the need to keep her emotions in check. "You assume a lot about what I want," she said, her voice calm but firm. "And yet, I don't recall you ever asking me." Jackson's patience visibly thinned. "Hannah, enough." His voice carried the weight of authority he had always used to control her. "You have obligations. This family has obligations." Hannah turned to face him fully, her chin lifting. "Obligations, or expectations, because those are two very different things." July sighed, exasperated. "Why are you making this difficult? You know what this means for all of us." Hannah's jaw tightened, and for a moment David thought she might actually walk away. But then something shifted in her eyes. Hesitation, doubt. And that was exactly what her parents were waiting for. Jackson seized the moment. "Hannah, listen to me," he said, his tone softer, coaxing. "We raised you to be strong, to do what's necessary for the people who rely on you. We're not asking for something unreasonable. We're asking you to be responsible." David had to fight the urge to step into the room, to call Jackson out on his manipulation. But he knew Hannah needed to fight this battle on her own. He had to trust that she would see through the words crafted to guilt her into compliance. For a long moment, Hannah said nothing. Then she turned toward Harold. "I'll consider it," she said, her voice even. David stiffened. So did Harold, his smirk widening just a fraction. "That's all I ask," he said smoothly, lifting his glass in a silent toast. Jackson and July exchanged glances, satisfied. David, however, knew this wasn't over. He could see it in the way Hannah's fingers trembled at her sides, in the way her shoulders remained rigid even as she appeared composed. This wasn't a victory for her parents. This was survival, and David wasn't going to stand by and watch her fight this battle alone. As the conversation moved toward pleasantries and dinner arrangements, David turned and slipped back through the hallway. He needed to think. He needed to act. Because if Hannah was going to consider this marriage, then David had a very short window to show her the truth, and he wasn't going to let time run out. The night air was thick with humidity as David stepped outside, his mind racing. The conversation in the parlor had played out exactly as he feared. Jackson and July had cornered Hannah, used every tactic they had to manipulate her, and in the end they had gotten what they wanted: hesitation. She hadn't agreed, but she hadn't refused either, and that was dangerous. It meant they were winning. He exhaled sharply, pushing a hand through his hair as he walked toward the car, needing space, needing to think. The situation was slipping, and he couldn't let that happen. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. Nathan. He swiped to answer. "Tell me you have something," he muttered. "I have something," Nathan confirmed, his voice low and serious. "It's about the missing money." David's pulse kicked up. "Go on." "The numbers don't add up, man. Jackson isn't just broke. He's covering something up. There's a series of untraceable transactions linked to one of his offshore accounts. And guess what? A portion of it got funneled back under a different name, a name that's been off the grid for years." David stopped cold. He knew what was coming before Nathan even said it. "Elliot Harrington," Nathan finished. Silence stretched between them. Elliot, Hannah's older brother, the one everyone believed was gone, disappeared years ago without a trace. David had always found it odd that no one ever spoke about him. It was as if the Harringtons had erased him completely. But now there was proof he wasn't just a ghost. He was connected to the money, and Jackson had been hiding it. "This changes everything," David muttered, his grip tightening on the phone. If Elliot was alive, then Jackson had a bigger secret than just being bankrupt. He had a reason to keep Hannah close, to marry her off to Harold quickly, to maintain control over everything before the truth surfaced. "What's the play?" Nathan asked. David turned his gaze back toward the mansion, the glow of the lights in the windows stark against the darkness of the night. "I need to get inside," he said. "Hannah needs to know." David slipped back inside the estate through the side entrance, moving with practiced ease through the dimly lit corridors. The Harrington mansion was designed to exude power: tall ceilings, antique chandeliers, gold-trimmed furnishings. But beneath its grandeur, David saw the truth. This was a house built on illusions, on carefully placed facades meant to mask the rot within. And Hannah was trapped inside it. His mind raced as he replayed Nathan's words. Elliot Harrington wasn't just alive, he was tied to Jackson's missing money. That meant the narrative everyone had been fed for years was a lie. Jackson had spent a fortune to erase his son's existence, but why? Did Elliot leave on his own, or was he forced out? And why would Jackson need to funnel money to him in secret? Whatever the truth was, David knew one thing for certain. Jackson wasn't just trying to salvage his business, he was covering up something far bigger. The murmur of voices from the main parlor pulled David from his thoughts. He slowed his pace, careful to stay out of sight as he reached the edge of the hallway. Peering around the corner, he saw Hannah still seated with her parents and Harold, though her expression had hardened. She was listening, but she was no longer a passive participant in their game. "You're making it sound like I have no choice," Hannah said, her voice carefully controlled, though David could hear the edge beneath it. Jackson sighed as if her resistance was exhausting. "I'm saying this is the best choice. You know what's at stake, Hannah." "What's at stake?" she repeated, setting her glass down with deliberate precision. "You mean the business? The estate? The family name?" She leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "Tell me something, Father. If everything is truly falling apart, then why is money still moving in and out of offshore accounts under names that don't belong to you?" The room fell into a charged silence. David felt his breath still. She knew. Jackson barely reacted, but David caught the quick flicker of his expression, shock, quickly masked by calm calculation. "You've been looking into my finances?" he asked, his tone neutral but laced with warning. Hannah didn't flinch. "I pay attention, and I'm not as naive as you think I am." For the first time that evening, David saw something shift in Jackson's demeanor. This wasn't the confident businessman playing puppet master. This was a man cornered. July exhaled dramatically, setting her drink down. "Hannah, darling, you're over-analyzing things again. Your father has always handled our affairs responsibly. There's nothing to be concerned about." "Is that why Elliot disappeared?" The air turned electric. David had expected hesitation, but not this. She was already putting the pieces together. Jackson's hand tightened around his glass, but he kept his voice smooth. "Elliot left of his own accord." Hannah studied him. "And yet his name keeps showing up where it shouldn't." David could see Harold watching the exchange with thinly veiled amusement, as if this was all some form of entertainment for him. He leaned back, swirling the dark liquid in his glass. "This is fascinating," he mused. "I didn't realize this dinner would turn into a family interrogation." Jackson sent him a warning glance before shifting his focus back to Hannah. "You don't need to concern yourself with this. What matters right now is the future. Your future." "My future, or the one you've chosen for me," she countered. David's pulse thrummed as he watched her stand her ground. This wasn't just defiance. This was a battle she was willing to fight. But then Jackson leaned forward, his expression turning solemn. "Hannah," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "if you want to know the truth about Elliot, you need to stop looking. Some things are better left buried." David stiffened. That was a threat. Hannah's fingers curled into her lap, but she held her ground. "I don't believe that." Jackson exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Hannah, I'm trying to protect you." "By marrying me off to a man I barely know?" David could see the cracks forming in Jackson's facade, the frustration building behind his composed exterior. "Harold is a good man. He can offer you stability, and whether you like it or not, we need this." Hannah scoffed. "You need this. Don't mistake your desperation for mine." Harold chuckled. "She's got spirit. I'll give her that." Jackson shot him a sharp look before turning back to Hannah. "You're acting reckless. I don't want you chasing ghosts." Hannah held his gaze. "I don't think Elliot is a ghost, and I'm going to find out the truth, with or without your help." Jackson's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, she rose from her chair. "This conversation is over," she said, her voice quiet but commanding. "I'll consider my options, but I won't be forced into anything." Without waiting for a reply, she turned and strode toward the doorway, toward David's direction. His heart pounded as he took a step back into the shadows. He hadn't planned to be seen, but fate had other ideas. The moment she stepped into the hall, her eyes locked onto his. Her expression didn't shift, didn't betray any reaction. But in that brief moment, David saw something behind her gaze, recognition and understanding. She knew he had been listening. And for the first time since stepping into this house, Hannah didn't look alone. This was only the beginning. The air between them was thick with unspoken words as Hannah stepped fully into the dimly lit hallway. Her gaze remained locked onto David's, searching, questioning. She knew he had been there, listening, but she didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked like someone who had been waiting for confirmation that she wasn't the only one seeing through the lies. David stood his ground, keeping his expression neutral, but inside, his mind raced. This was a moment he hadn't planned for, at least not so soon. He expected to operate in the shadows longer, to gather more information before revealing anything. But now, standing in front of her, with the weight of the truth pressing down on both of them, he knew there was no turning back. Hannah was the first to speak. "How much did you hear?" Her voice was quiet, but there was no fear in it. David considered his response carefully. He could lie, pretend he had only caught snippets, but that wouldn't help either of them. "Enough." She studied him for a long moment, and then to his surprise she nodded. "Good. That makes things easier." David's brow furrowed. "Easier?" Hannah glanced down the hallway, as if checking for anyone who might overhear. Then, in a move that caught him completely off guard, she grabbed his wrist and pulled him further into the shadows, out of sight of the parlor. "If you already know, then I won't waste time explaining," she said in a low voice. "But if you're here to convince me to do what my parents want, don't bother." David shook his head. "That's not why I'm here." Her grip on his wrist loosened slightly. "Then why are you here?" David hesitated. This was the moment, the first real crack in the wall she had built between herself and the people trying to control her. He had to tread carefully. "Because I think you already know that something is wrong, and I think you want the truth just as much as I do." Hannah's eyes searched his face, looking for deception. She would find none. For a brief moment it felt like she might say something more, but then the sound of footsteps approaching made them both tense. Hannah dropped her hand from his wrist and stepped back, just as Harold's voice echoed through the corridor. "There you are," Harold drawled, his smug grin in place as he stopped a few feet away. His gaze flicked between Hannah and David before settling on her. "I was wondering where you ran off to." Hannah's posture stiffened, but her expression remained composed. "I needed some air." Harold nodded, but his smirk didn't waver. "Of course. Can't have you suffocating before the big decision, now can we?" He let out a chuckle, as if this was all a game. His eyes flicked to David, finally acknowledging his presence. "And you? Shouldn't you be somewhere else?" David met his gaze without flinching. "Just doing my job, sir." Harold hummed, amused but uninterested. "Right, the help." Something flickered in Hannah's expression. Disapproval, anger, or perhaps something else entirely. She stepped slightly closer to David, just enough for Harold to notice. "I'll be inside soon," she said to Harold, her tone leaving no room for argument. Harold hesitated for a moment before forcing another grin. "Take your time." With one last look at David, he turned and walked back toward the main hall. As soon as he was gone, Hannah exhaled. She turned back to David, her voice quieter now. "You want the truth?" David nodded. "Then meet me in the East Garden. Midnight." Before he could respond, she turned and walked away. David stood there, watching her disappear down the corridor. This was the moment everything changed. David remained still for a moment, watching as Hannah disappeared back into the parlor, her posture composed, but her movements sharper than before. She was playing her part well, just enough resistance to keep her parents uneasy, but not enough to make them believe she was outright rebelling. Smart, calculated. But how long could she keep this up before they forced her hand? His mind churned as he made his way back toward the side exit. Midnight. The East Garden. She wanted answers just as much as he did. That was progress, but it also meant she was stepping into dangerous territory. If Jackson suspected she was digging into the truth, his manipulation would only grow more ruthless. And Harold, David had seen men like him before. Powerful, arrogant, and unwilling to be denied what they believed was theirs. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a thick scent of damp earth and the distant rustling of tree branches in the wind. David reached his car, leaning against it as he pulled out his phone. Nathan. He needed an update. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "You're calling faster than I expected. That good or that bad?" Nathan's voice was laced with curiosity. "She's meeting me tonight," David said, keeping his voice low. There was a slight pause. Then, "Huh? Well, that's a hell of a development." David exhaled. "Yeah, but I need more. We don't have time for a slow reveal. Jackson is getting desperate, and Harold—" He clenched his jaw. "He's getting comfortable. Too comfortable." Nathan cursed under his breath. "Then we speed things up. I dug deeper into those offshore transactions. They don't just link to Elliot. They link to a shell corporation, one that's been paying out large sums over the past few years to an unknown recipient." David straightened. "Could it be Elliot?" "Maybe. But here's the kicker. One of those payouts was made only a few weeks ago, right before Jackson started pushing for Hannah's engagement to Harold." David's grip tightened around the phone. This wasn't just about salvaging a broken business. Jackson wasn't just protecting himself. He was covering something up, something urgent. "I need to know who received that money," David said. "I'm already on it," Nathan assured him. "But David, be careful. If Jackson is paying people off, it means he's afraid. And afraid men make dangerous decisions." David already knew that. He ended the call, slipping the phone back into his pocket as he glanced up at the towering mansion. The lights in the parlor still burned brightly, but on the second floor, the curtains of one of the rooms shifted slightly. He recognized that room. It was Hannah's. She was waiting. Midnight arrived slowly, each minute dragging as David kept his eyes on the estate. He moved carefully through the side gardens, following the stone pathway that led to the east garden. It was a part of the estate that was rarely used, quiet, hidden behind the high hedges. If Hannah had chosen this spot, it meant she wanted privacy. He stepped under the archway of ivy-covered trellises, pausing as he spotted her standing near the edge of the fountain. She wasn't wearing the elegant dresses she had been forced into earlier. She had changed into something simpler, a dark sweater and fitted pants, her hair loose. "You actually came," she said as he approached, her arms crossed. "I said I would." David kept his voice even. "Did you have doubts?" She studied him for a moment before shaking her head. "Number. That's the problem." David raised an eyebrow but didn't push. Instead, he took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You wanted the truth. I have some of it. But I need to know what you already suspect." Hannah let out a slow breath, glancing away briefly before meeting his gaze again. "I know my father is hiding something. I know Elliot didn't just leave the way they said he did. And I know they're desperate to control me, because whatever's happening is bigger than just losing money." David nodded, encouraged. "You're right. And it's worse than you think." Her jaw tensed. "Tell me." He hesitated for only a second before stepping closer, lowering his voice further. "Your father has been moving money into offshore accounts for years. Recently, large payouts have been made to a recipient we haven't identified yet. But we do know one thing. Elliot is connected, and one of the payments was sent right before they started forcing your engagement." Hannah's eyes darkened. "That means Harold isn't just a solution to their financial problems. He's part of something bigger." David nodded. "And whatever it is, your father is willing to do anything to make sure it stays buried." Hannah clenched her fists. She had suspected, but hearing it confirmed out loud was different, more real, more dangerous. "What do we do?" she asked. David didn't hesitate. "We find Elliot." Her breath hitched slightly, but she nodded. "Where do we start?" David glanced toward the mansion, toward the people who were already tightening their grip around her. "With the one person who knows the whole story." Hannah followed his gaze, realization dawning in her eyes. Jackson Harrington. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. This was about confronting it. And there was no turning back now. The night was still, but inside the Harrington estate, tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Hannah sat in her dimly lit bedroom, staring at the documents David had given her. Offshore accounts, untraceable transactions, large sums of money disappearing and reappearing under different aliases. And Elliot's name, buried in the details like a ghost from a past she barely remembered. Her heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't just a financial crisis. This was something far more insidious. A soft knock at the door snapped her out of her thoughts. She quickly gathered the papers and tucked them into the drawer of her vanity before calling out, "Come in." The door opened and July stepped inside, her silk robe tied neatly at the waist. Her expression was unreadable, but Hannah knew her mother well enough to recognize when she was hiding something. "You should be resting," July said smoothly, stepping further into the room. "Tomorrow is an important day." Hannah forced a neutral expression. "Why? Is Harold proposing?" July smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "He'll make it official soon enough. And when he does, I expect you to accept." Hannah exhaled sharply. "And if I don't?" July's smile didn't falter, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "Then you'll be making a very unfortunate mistake." Hannah felt the weight behind her words. A threat, subtle but firm. Her mother wasn't asking anymore. She was demanding. "I don't understand why you and Father are so desperate to force this," Hannah said, crossing her arms. "This is more than just money, isn't it?" July's gaze hardened. "We are doing what's best for you." "For me?" Hannah scoffed. "Or for the family name?" July's posture remained composed, but her grip tightened slightly on the edge of her robe. For a split second, Hannah thought she might actually tell her the truth. But instead, July reached for her hand, her touch deceptively gentle. "You don't understand the full picture yet, darling," she murmured. "But soon you will." Before Hannah could respond, July leaned forward and placed a soft kiss on her forehead. "Get some rest. Tomorrow, everything changes." With that, she turned and left the room, closing the door quietly behind her. Hannah stood frozen in place, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Her mother's words weren't just a warning, they were a promise. Hannah exhaled slowly, her mother's lingering presence leaving an uneasy chill in the air. Tomorrow, everything changes. The words echoed in her mind, laced with something far darker than just expectation. It wasn't just about her engagement anymore. It was a calculated move, a step in a game she hadn't even realized she was playing until now. She turned back to the drawer where she had hidden the documents. Her fingers hovered over the handle for a moment before she pulled it open, her eyes scanning the papers once more. Elliot's name, the offshore transactions, the missing money. The pieces were all there, but she needed more. She needed leverage. A tap at her window made her snap her head up, her pulse spiking. For a split second, she feared it was one of her father's men, sent to make sure she didn't step out of line. But when she pulled back the curtain, she found David standing just outside, half hidden in the shadows of the estate gardens. She didn't hesitate. Sliding open the window, she climbed onto the balcony, gripping the railing as she peered down at him. "What are you doing here?" she whispered. David kept his voice low. "You said you wanted the truth. I have more." Hannah glanced back toward her door, listening for any sounds from the hallway. Her mother had just left, but she couldn't be sure she wouldn't return. If she was caught meeting David, there would be no more time, no more chances. Still, she couldn't walk away from this. Not now. She climbed over the balcony railing, her heartbeat hammering as she lowered herself carefully down. David was there in an instant, reaching up to steady her. The moment her feet touched the ground, she let out a breath of relief, but David didn't let go just yet. "You sure about this?" he murmured. She nodded, determination hardening her features. "Tell me everything." David wasted no time. Nathan found another link to Elliot. "He's alive, but he's off the grid, intentionally. Your father didn't just push him out, he paid to have him erased." Hannah swallowed hard. "Why?" David hesitated before answering. "Because Elliot knows something that could destroy your father." A sharp chill ran down her spine. "I need to find him," she whispered. David nodded. "We do." Hannah looked back at the estate, at the towering mansion that had been her prison for years. For the first time, she wasn't just thinking about escaping. She was thinking about fighting back, and she wasn't going to do it alone. The air was thick with tension as David led Hannah through the darkened garden, their footsteps silent against the damp earth. The estate loomed behind them, its towering walls a stark reminder of the control her family had over her life. But tonight, for the first time, Hannah was breaking free, if only for a moment. David had arranged a meeting, someone who could give them more answers about Elliot. They didn't have time to waste. With Jackson pushing for her engagement and July watching her every move, Hannah knew she was running out of opportunities to get ahead of whatever scheme her family was weaving. She tightened her coat around her body, glancing up at David as they neared the estate's side gate. "Who are we meeting?" she whispered. "A man named Ray Connors," David said quietly. "He used to work for your father. Now he's just trying to keep himself from getting buried like the rest of them." Hannah frowned. "And you trust him?" "I trust that he's scared enough to talk." David stopped near a cluster of tall hedges, signaling for her to wait as he scanned the perimeter. The estate was massive, but the security wasn't as airtight as Jackson probably believed. There were blind spots, places where David had already tested the boundaries. He gestured for her to follow, and they slipped out through the narrow side gate, disappearing into the shadows of the road beyond. A sleek black car was parked a few yards away, the engine humming softly. The headlights flicked on briefly, once, twice. A signal. David opened the passenger door for her, and she slid inside, trying to steady her breath. The man in the driver's seat was older, maybe mid-50s, with graying hair and tired eyes that darted between them as David climbed in beside her. "You weren't followed?" Ray Connors asked, his voice gruff. David shook his head. "We were careful." Ray let out a slow breath before turning his gaze to Hannah. "You're just like him, you know." Hannah's stomach tightened. "Like who?" Ray's expression darkened. "Your brother." She swallowed hard. "So he is alive." Ray hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. But if you're looking for him, you need to be careful. There are people who don't want him found. And if Jackson knows you're digging, you're in just as much danger as he was." Hannah clenched her fists. "Then tell me everything you know." Ray exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Elliot didn't disappear by choice. Your father made him." David and Hannah exchanged a sharp glance. Ray continued, lowering his voice. "Elliot found out something he wasn't supposed to, and when he tried to fight back, Jackson removed him." Hannah's heart pounded. "What did he find out?" Ray's jaw tightened. "The kind of truth that gets people killed." Hannah's breath hitched, but she forced herself to stay composed. Her father had always been ruthless, but the way Ray spoke, like this wasn't just about business or financial ruin, sent a chill down her spine. David leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Ray, we don't have time for riddles. If Elliot is alive and in hiding, we need to know why. What truth did he uncover?" Ray's fingers drummed against the steering wheel, his shoulders stiff with hesitation. He glanced out the windshield as if expecting someone to be watching. Elliot found out that Jackson wasn't just laundering money. He was working with people you don't cross, people who make you disappear if you get in their way. Hannah's throat tightened. What people? Ray looked at her, his expression grim. The kind that don't leave loose ends. She swallowed hard. You're saying my father got involved with criminals? Worse. Ray's voice was barely above a whisper. He got in bed with people who control more than just money. They control outcomes, businesses, elections, entire industries. Your father was a pawn in something much bigger than him, and when Elliot found out, he tried to expose it. David's jaw tightened. And Jackson made sure that didn't happen. Ray nodded. Your father didn't kill him, at least not directly, but he made sure Elliot had no way to fight back. He stripped him of everything, cut off every contact, every financial asset. And when that wasn't enough, he put a bounty on his own son's head. Hannah's stomach twisted. She felt like she might be sick. He tried to have him killed. Ray exhaled sharply. If Elliot hadn't disappeared when he did, he wouldn't be breathing today. The weight of his words settled over them like a suffocating fog. Hannah gripped the edges of her coat to keep her hands from shaking. She had spent years believing her brother had abandoned her, had left without looking back. But now she knew the truth. David's voice cut through the silence. Do you know where he is? Ray hesitated, then shook his head. Not exactly, but I know where he was last seen. A contact of mine mentioned a man matching his description hiding in Savannah. If he's still there, he's staying off the grid. Hannah inhaled sharply. Then that's where we go. David turned to her. Hannah. No. Her voice was firm, stronger than it had been all night. I'm done waiting for my father to control the narrative. If Elliot is alive, I'm going to find him. David studied her for a long moment before nodding. Then we leave tonight. Ray let out a breath. If you're serious about this, you need to be careful. If Jackson finds out— He won't, Hannah interrupted. Not until it's too late. Ray nodded slowly, as if weighing his decision. Then he reached into the glove compartment, pulling out a folded piece of paper. This is the last address I heard about. It's not much, but it's a start. Hannah took it with steady hands. David gave Ray a final nod. Thank you. Ray hesitated before gripping the steering wheel. Be smart about this. The moment you start digging, you become a target. Hannah's gaze hardened. Then I guess it's time I stop running. As she and David slipped out of the car, the night around them suddenly felt heavier. The truth had finally surfaced. But with it came danger, and by morning, everything would change. The night felt heavier as David and Hannah drove away from the Harrington estate, leaving behind the carefully constructed world of deception her family had built. The highway stretched endlessly ahead of them, the city lights fading in the rearview mirror. Savannah. That was their destination. If Elliot had truly gone into hiding there, they had a chance, a small one, to find him before Jackson or his associates realized what they were up to. Hannah sat in the passenger seat, her fingers tightening around the crumpled paper with Elliot's last known address. She hadn't spoken much since they left. David could feel the weight of it all pressing down on her, but he also knew this wasn't the time to push. After a long silence, she finally spoke. I used to think he left because he didn't care. Her voice was quiet, almost lost beneath the hum of the engine. But all this time he was running for his life. David kept his hands steady on the wheel. Your father didn't give him a choice. She let out a humorless laugh. My father never gives anyone a choice. David glanced at her. Even in the dim light of the car, he could see the resolve setting in her features. This wasn't just about finding Elliot anymore. This was about reclaiming her own life, her own decisions. "We should assume we're being watched," David said after a moment. "Jackson isn't stupid. If he thinks you're getting too close to the truth, he'll act." Hannah nodded. "I know." Then she turned to him, her gaze sharper now. "But you're forgetting something, David." He raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "I'm his daughter," she said, her lips curving slightly. "And that means I know how he thinks." David let out a quiet chuckle. "Good, because we're going to need that." They drove for hours, the miles stretching between them and the life Hannah was leaving behind. The sky had begun to lighten when David finally pulled off the highway onto a quiet street in Savannah. It was an older part of town, narrow roads lined with weathered buildings, the charm of the past lingering in every cracked brick and iron gate. David parked a block away from the address Ray had given them. They both scanned their surroundings, instincts sharp, no obvious tales, no signs they had been followed. But that didn't mean they were safe. Hannah exhaled. "This is it." David nodded. "Let's go." They stepped out of the car, moving quickly but cautiously. The building in front of them was a run-down townhouse, its shutters closed, paint peeling from the door. It looked abandoned, but David had been in the game long enough to know that meant nothing. He knocked once, then again. Silence. David glanced at Hannah before reaching for the doorknob. But before he could turn it, the door jerked open from the inside, and a gun was pointed straight at his chest. The engine hummed softly as David drove through the quiet streets, keeping to the shadows, avoiding well-lit roads. The weight of what they had just learned pressed down on both of them, thick and suffocating. Hannah sat in the passenger seat, her fingers clenched around the folded piece of paper Ray had given her. Every time she glanced down at the scribbled address, her heart pounded harder. Savannah. Her brother was alive. She had spent years resenting him, believing he had abandoned her, but now she knew the truth. He had been erased, just like David had suspected. And if what Ray said was true, Elliot wasn't just hiding. He was running from something far more dangerous than their father. David's grip on the wheel was tight, his knuckles white. "We need a plan," he muttered, breaking the heavy silence. "If Elliot is still there, he's not going to trust anyone who comes looking for him. And if your father really put a price on his head, someone else might already be watching him." Hannah exhaled sharply. "We don't have time for a perfect plan. If he's in danger, we need to get to him before my father does." David glanced at her, his jaw tightening. "Hannah, this isn't just about finding him. If Jackson knows you're gone, he'll come after you too." "I know," she said, staring out at the road ahead. "But for the first time, I don't care." David sighed, shifting gears as they pulled onto the highway. He understood the urgency. He felt it too. But he also knew this wasn't just about Hannah's emotions. This was about survival. They drove in silence for a long stretch, the miles passing in a blur of streetlights and distant cityscapes. The further they got from Charleston, the heavier the air became. Hannah's mind raced with questions, possibilities, fears. Then David's phone buzzed in the cup holder between them. He grabbed it without taking his eyes off the road. "Nathan," he said into the speaker. "Where the hell are you?" Nathan's voice was sharp, urgent. David's grip tightened. "On our way to Savannah." "Why?" There was a brief silence before Nathan cursed under his breath. "Then you need to turn around. Now." Hannah's stomach dropped. "What? Why?" Nathan's voice was edged with something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "Because Jackson knows." The car swerved slightly as David tightened his hands around the wheel. "How the hell does he—" "He's already moving, David. He knows you and Hannah left, and he's sending people after you." A cold chill ran down Hannah's spine. David cursed. "How much of a head start do we have?" Nathan hesitated. "Maybe an hour, maybe less. But listen to me. This isn't just Jackson trying to drag Hannah home. He's scared, and scared men don't play fair. Hannah swallowed hard, her pulse hammering. Her father was hunting them. David glanced at her, his expression unreadable, but she saw the way his jaw clenched. He was calculating, strategizing. Do we have another route? Nathan exhaled sharply. There's a back road near Beaufort. Take that and cut west before Savannah. It might buy you some time. David nodded. Got it. But Hannah wasn't listening anymore. Her thoughts were racing, colliding into each other as she tried to make sense of it all. Jackson wasn't just angry. He was afraid, and that meant they were closer to the truth than she ever realized. David's hands were steady on the wheel, but his mind was already running through every possible worst-case scenario. They had less than an hour before Jackson's people caught up to them. That wasn't enough time. If Jackson had already set things in motion, it meant he wasn't just trying to bring Hannah back, he was trying to make sure she didn't uncover the truth. Hannah sat stiffly beside him, gripping the armrest as the city lights faded into the dark countryside. The weight of everything pressed down on her. Her father's betrayal, the realization that Elliot had been running for his life, and now the fact that they were being hunted like fugitives. We need to stop thinking like we're on the run, David said suddenly, his voice cutting through the thick tension. If we keep running, they'll eventually catch up. We need to get ahead of them. Hannah turned to him, her eyes sharp. What are you suggesting? We stop playing defense. His grip on the wheel tightened as he took a sudden turn onto an unmarked back road, the tires kicking up loose gravel. We stop reacting. We make a move before they do. She swallowed hard, nodding. You have something in mind? David glanced at her. Nathan said Jackson was scared. If he's scared, it means he's desperate, and desperate men get sloppy. Hannah's pulse quickened. You think he left something behind? David's lips pressed into a thin line. I think if we dig in the right places, we'll find exactly what he doesn't want us to see. She exhaled, glancing out the window as the dark trees blurred past. Then we need to find Elliot before Jackson does. David nodded, checking the rearview mirror. No headlights. Not yet. We don't go straight to Savannah. We find a safe place to regroup, figure out our next step. Hannah hesitated, then reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the folded address Ray had given them. She traced the ink with her fingers, her mind made up. There's an abandoned motel a few miles outside Savannah. We can stop there. David's gaze flickered to her, searching for any signs of doubt. He found none. Then that's where we go. He stepped on the gas, pushing the car faster into the night. They had to be faster than Jackson, because if they weren't, this wouldn't just be about finding Elliot anymore. It would be about surviving. The road stretched endlessly before them, a dark ribbon cutting through the vast emptiness of the countryside. The occasional flicker of headlights in the distance sent jolts of adrenaline through Hannah's veins, but each time the vehicle turned away, disappearing down some unseen path. Not Jackson's people, at least not yet. David remained focused, his jaw tight, eyes scanning the road ahead, while his mind likely ran through contingency plans. He was always thinking 3 steps ahead, but even he couldn't predict how far Jackson was willing to go. Hannah tightened her grip on the piece of paper in her lap. Savannah, the motel, Elliot. It felt like she was chasing ghosts, following the trail of a brother she barely remembered, hoping against hope that they weren't already too late. She glanced at David. What if he doesn't want to be found? David kept his gaze forward. Then we make him want to be. His confidence was steady, unshaken, but Hannah knew better. He wasn't just saying it for her sake. He was saying it for himself. He needed this to work just as much as she did. The car rumbled over uneven pavement as they finally turned off the main highway, following the winding back roads toward the address Ray had given them. The motel was a forgotten relic of another era, its neon sign flickering weakly, barely casting any light over the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. The place looked abandoned, which made it perfect. David pulled into a spot near the far end, shutting off the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. Hannah exhaled, her breath unsteady. This is it. David reached for the gun tucked under his jacket, checking the magazine before sliding it back into place. His movements were fluid, controlled, second nature. Hannah swallowed hard. You think we'll need that? David's expression darkened. I don't take chances. She nodded, forcing herself to push away the fear creeping into her chest. They stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching softly beneath their feet. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked asphalt and mildew. The motel looked like it hadn't seen a guest in years. David approached the office door first, testing the handle. Unlocked. He exchanged a glance with Hannah before stepping inside. The interior was as run down as she expected. Faded floral wallpaper peeling at the edges, a dust-covered reception desk, the faint hum of a flickering light bulb overhead. Then a noise. A floorboard creaked somewhere beyond the hallway. David's hand went to his gun instantly, his movements silent as he stepped forward. Hannah's pulse spiked, but she followed, keeping close behind him. Another creak. Then a shadow moved. Before she could react, David had already drawn his weapon, aiming toward the corner of the room. Step out. Now. Silence. Then a man emerged from the darkness. His face was obscured by overgrown hair, his clothes worn, but his eyes were sharp, calculating, alive. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. Elliot, she whispered. Her brother had just come out of hiding, and everything was about to change. Elliot didn't move. He stood in the dim light, his eyes locked onto Hannah's with an intensity that made the air feel heavy. His features were sharper than she remembered, his once polished appearance now replaced with the rugged weariness of a man who had been running for too long. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair slightly unkempt, but his posture remained steady, a man who had learned to survive in the shadows. Hannah's breath hitched. He was real, alive. After years of silence, years of believing he had abandoned her, here he was, standing right in front of her. David kept his gun raised, his stance firm. You've got about 5 seconds to tell me if you're expecting company. Elliot's lips pressed into a thin line before he exhaled sharply. Put that thing away. If I wanted you dead, I wouldn't have let you see me. David didn't lower his weapon. Not an answer. Elliot rolled his eyes, his voice edged with irritation. I'm alone, but if you made it this far, it means we don't have much time before they figure out where I am. Hannah stepped forward, ignoring the tension radiating between the two men. Elliot, she said, her voice quieter now, as if speaking his name would make him vanish again. His gaze softened, just slightly. You shouldn't have come here, Hannah. Anger flickered in her chest. And what? Just keep believing you left because you didn't care? Let Jackson win? Elliot flinched at their father's name, but quickly masked it with indifference. You don't know what you're dealing with. Hannah clenched her fists. Then tell me. David finally lowered his gun, though his grip remained firm. We already know about the money, the offshore accounts, the cover-ups. We know Jackson put a target on your back. What we don't know is why. Elliot's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the door, as if deciding whether he should run again. But then he let out a slow breath and looked back at Hannah. You want the truth? He asked, his voice low. Hannah nodded. Elliot's eyes darkened. Then you better be ready for war. Elliot didn't wait for a response. He turned sharply and walked deeper into the motel room, leaving Hannah and David with no choice but to follow. The air inside was stale, filled with the lingering scent of dust and something metallic. A single lamp flickered near the far wall, casting long shadows across the cluttered room. Papers, maps, old photographs, scattered across a worn wooden table like remnants of a life destroyed. Hannah's stomach twisted as she took it all in. "What is this?" Elliot ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "Everything Jackson doesn't want you to know." David stepped closer, his sharp eyes scanning the mess. "Then start talking." Elliot exhaled, gripping the edge of the table. "Jackson isn't just laundering money. He's funneling it into something bigger, something illegal. Years ago, I started looking into discrepancies in the family business. Funds were disappearing, accounts didn't match. I thought it was simple corruption at first, a scheme to keep the company afloat." His voice darkened. "But then I found this." He grabbed a file from the pile and shoved it toward David, who flipped it open. Transaction records, shell companies, names tied to offshore accounts. It was extensive, too big for one man to orchestrate alone. Hannah's blood ran cold as she caught a glimpse of the names. Some she recognized, some she didn't, but there was one in particular that made her throat tighten. Harold Montgomery. She took a step back, shaking her head. "Number, that doesn't make sense." Elliot let out a bitter laugh. "You really think Harold is some lovesick fool who just wants to marry you for prestige? He's funding Jackson's operations. He's the reason our father hasn't collapsed under the weight of his own crimes. This isn't about saving the family name, Hannah." He met her gaze. "It's about keeping Harold quiet." Hannah felt the ground shift beneath her. Harold hadn't just been chosen for her, he owned a part of her future before she even had a say. David clenched his jaw, flipping through the documents faster. "This isn't just money laundering. This is international fraud, bribery. Hell, some of these connections run into federal investigations." He looked up at Elliot. "You were going to turn him in." Elliot gave a hollow smile. "I was naive enough to think I could." He exhaled sharply. "Jackson found out before I could act. He destroyed everything I had, cut off my access, ruined my credibility, and when that wasn't enough, he made sure I had no choice but to disappear." His voice hardened. "And now he's doing the same thing to you." Hannah's hands curled into fists. "So what do we do?" Elliot's expression turned grim. "We take Jackson down, and we start with Harold." David nodded, his mind already working through the next steps. But Hannah, she couldn't stop staring at the pile of evidence, the years of lies unraveling in front of her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about ending this family's legacy of corruption before it swallowed her whole, and she wasn't going to let Jackson win. The motel room felt smaller now, suffocating under the weight of the truth that had just unraveled before them. Hannah sat rigid, her fingers gripping the edge of the chair as if anchoring herself to something real. Everything she had believed, everything she had trusted, was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. David stood near the doorway, his back pressed against the wall, his gaze flickering between Elliot and the files on the table. He had seen corruption before. He had uncovered secrets powerful men wanted buried. But this was bigger than anything he had imagined. Elliot exhaled sharply, running a hand through his messy hair. "We don't have much time. If Jackson knows you're looking for me, then he knows you're close to the truth." Hannah looked up, her jaw tightening. "Then we hit first." David's head turned sharply toward her. "Hannah, no." She cut him off, her voice steady. "I've spent my entire life following their rules, being the perfect daughter, the perfect pawn. And for what? So they could sell me to Harold and keep their empire intact." She shook her head. I'm done playing their game. It's time to end it. Elliot studied her for a moment, something flickering in his gaze. Approval, perhaps. You're ready for this? Hannah met his stare without hesitation. I don't have a choice. David pushed off the wall, stepping toward them. Then we do this smart. We can't just expose Jackson. We need to take Harold down too. He pointed at the files on the table. If Harold is funding this operation, that means there's money, paper trails, records, things that link him directly to your father's crimes. Elliot nodded. There is, and I know where to find it. Hannah's heart pounded. Where? Elliot glanced toward the window, his expression grim. In Harold's private office, at tomorrow night's gala. Silence stretched between them. David cursed under his breath. Of course, the biggest event of the season. He rubbed his temples. That place will be swarming with security. Exactly, Elliot said. No one would expect a heist in the middle of a high-profile gala. It's the perfect cover. Hannah inhaled sharply. Then that's where we go. David shook his head. You don't understand. This isn't just walking in and grabbing a few papers. If we do this, we'll be stealing from the most dangerous man in the room. If we're caught, then we make sure we're not caught, Hannah interrupted. She turned to Elliot. What's the plan? Elliot hesitated, then pulled a small USB drive from his pocket. Jackson and Harold keep everything under lock and key, but they also keep digital backups. This, he held up the drive, has a program that will extract all encrypted financial transactions, including the ones linking Harold directly to the laundering scheme. David narrowed his eyes. And how do we get that onto his system? Elliot smirked. We plug it in. David exhaled, shaking his head. It's never that simple. Elliot shrugged. It is if you know what you're doing. Hannah straightened. Then we better not fail. The battle lines were drawn. Tomorrow they would walk into that gala as guests. By the time they walked out, Harold Montgomery and Jackson Harrington would fall. David rubbed his jaw, his mind already piecing together the logistics of what they were about to do. A heist at the most exclusive gala of the year. It was madness. The kind of madness that either ended in victory or in handcuffs. Or worse. He turned to Elliot. Tell me you have a way in. Elliot smirked. I used to have full access to the estate before our dear father erased me. Security might be tight, but I still know my way around. He tapped the USB drive against the wooden table. Harold's office is in the East Wing, second floor. Everything he wants to keep hidden, that's where he locks it away. David crossed his arms. And the security system? Elliot's smirk faded slightly. Upgraded since I left, but nothing we can't handle. They rely on facial recognition and keycard access for the high-security areas. Harold keeps his personal keycard on him at all times. David let out a low whistle. So we need to get close enough to steal his keycard, get into his office, plug in that drive, and extract the data, all while avoiding Jackson's people. Elliot's expression was unreadable. You wanted a challenge, didn't you? Hannah, who had been listening in silence, finally spoke. I'll do it. Both men turned to her. She stood, her hands firm against the table, her eyes burning with determination. Harold expects me to be there. He'll want me close. I can get the keycard. David frowned. Hannah, I know how he operates, she continued, ignoring his hesitation. He underestimates me. He'll see me as nothing more than the pretty bride-to-be he can parade around. But that's his weakness. She lifted her chin. I'll get the keycard. You two just make sure the rest of the plan goes off without a hitch. Elliot raised an eyebrow. You sure you're up for this? Hannah met his gaze without flinching. More than ever. David ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. It was risky. Too risky. But she was right. No one could get closer to Harold than she could. Fine, he said finally. But we need a backup plan. If something goes wrong, we need an exit strategy. Elliot nodded. There's a service tunnel that runs underneath the estate. It was originally used for staff, but Harold had it upgraded as an emergency exit. It connects to a secondary road about a mile from the estate. David's eyes narrowed. And how do you know this? Elliot smirked. Because I helped design it. Hannah took a deep breath. Then that's our way out. David still wasn't convinced, but they were running out of time. By tomorrow night, they had to be ready. Elliot grabbed another set of files from the pile and spread them across the table. Then let's go over every detail. We only get one shot at this. The room fell into a tense silence as the three of them huddled together, planning the downfall of the two most powerful men in their world. Tomorrow, they wouldn't just be stealing information. They would be stealing back control of their lives. And there was no room for failure. The grand estate was alive with light and music, the extravagant gala in full swing as Charleston's elite gathered in their finest attire. Crystal chandeliers bathed the ballroom in a golden glow, the murmur of conversation blending with the soft melodies of a string quartet. The scent of expensive perfume and aged whiskey filled the air, masking the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. Hannah stood at the top of the marble staircase, taking in the scene below with practiced indifference. She had been to 1,000 events like this, wearing a dress she hadn't chosen, playing a role she despised. But tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't just another Harrington daughter paraded for the approval of their world. Tonight, she was the one holding the cards. The deep emerald gown hugged her figure perfectly, every detail designed to catch attention. It had been July's idea. You need to look like a woman Harold can't say no to. But Hannah had no intention of giving Harold anything. She spotted him near the bar, his usual smug expression in place as he spoke with a group of older businessmen. He was relaxed, confident. He had no idea what was coming. A warm hand settled on the small of her back, and she barely suppressed a flinch before recognizing the familiar presence beside her. David! Dressed in a tailored black tuxedo, he looked every bit the part of the wealthy guests around them. But his posture, his sharp gaze scanning the crowd, he was a soldier in enemy territory. "You good," he murmured, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Hannah nodded once. "Harold's right where we need him." David's fingers briefly brushed against hers before he pulled away, careful not to draw attention. "Elliot's in position. As soon as you get the keycard, we move." She took a steadying breath. "Then let's get started." With that, she descended the staircase, her expression calm, poised, the perfect heiress. Harold saw her immediately. Of course he did. He always did. His lips curved into a slow smile as she approached, and he excused himself from his conversation, turning his full attention to her. "Hannah," he said smoothly, his eyes raking over her, "you look breathtaking tonight." She forced a polite smile, letting him take her hand and press a kiss to the back of it. "Thank you," she replied, her voice honeyed. "I was hoping we'd have a moment to talk." Harold's smile widened. "Of course. Shall we step outside?" "Perfect." She allowed him to lead her through the side doors onto the terrace, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the warmth of the ballroom. The estate grounds stretched out before them, the perfectly manicured gardens glowing under the moonlight. Hannah exhaled, turning to face him with a carefully measured expression. "Harold," she started, keeping her voice soft, hesitant. "There's something I need to tell you." His eyes gleamed with interest. "I'm listening." She hesitated just long enough to make him lean in slightly, lowering his guard. Then, as if nervous, she reached up, letting her fingers lightly brush against his chest. Her heart pounded, as she felt the cool metal of his security keycard clipped inside his jacket. One shot. She had to do this right. She tilted her chin up, feigning uncertainty. Do you ever wonder what life would be like if we didn't have to do things for our families? If we could just choose for ourselves? Harold chuckled, clearly amused. That's a lovely thought, darling. But people like us, we don't get to choose, we inherit legacies. Hannah forced a shy smile. Then I suppose we have to make the best of it. She let her fingers trail lower, and in one smooth motion she slipped the keycard free. Harold didn't notice. His eyes were too focused on her lips, his arrogance blinding him. She stepped back before he could move closer, her fingers tightening around the stolen card behind her back. I should go inside, she said sweetly, before my parents come looking. Harold studied her for a moment before nodding. Of course, but don't disappear on me just yet. She smiled, then turned, slipping back through the doors before he could say anything else. The moment she was inside, she felt a hand brush against hers. David. Without stopping, without looking at him, she passed the keycard into his palm. His fingers curled around it. The plan was in motion. David barely slowed his pace as he took the keycard from Hannah, tucking it seamlessly into his jacket pocket. His movements were precise, effortless. Just another man at a gala, adjusting his cufflinks, blending into the crowd. But beneath the surface, the countdown had already begun. Hannah didn't turn to look at him as she drifted back into the ballroom, slipping effortlessly into a conversation with a group of well-dressed socialites. She played her role perfectly, laughing lightly at some mundane remark, her demeanor poised and carefree. No one would suspect that she had just stolen from one of the most powerful men in the room. David wove through the guests, subtly scanning the room. Elliot was already in position near the east wing doors, nursing a glass of champagne like he belonged there. He caught David's gaze and gave the slightest nod. Showtime. David made his way toward the east corridor, careful not to draw attention as he slipped past a waiter carrying a tray of expensive whiskey. The moment he stepped out of the ballroom and into the quieter hallway, the noise of the party dimmed. The atmosphere changed. This was Harold's domain now. He reached the heavy oak doors of Harold's private office and pulled the keycard from his jacket. With one smooth motion, he swiped it against the security panel. The red light blinked once, then it turned green. David exhaled. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The office was lavish but cold, all polished mahogany and gleaming liquor bottles displayed in a glass case near the far wall. There were no family photos, no signs of personal attachment, just power. He moved quickly, shutting the door behind him before striding toward the massive desk in the center of the room. He knew they didn't have much time. Harold might not have noticed the missing keycard yet, but security would. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the USB drive Elliot had given him, flipping open Harold's laptop. The screen came to life, demanding a password. David cursed under his breath. Of course. He didn't have time to crack it manually. Instead, he plugged the USB in and let Elliot's program do its work. It would override the encryption, extract the data, and send it to Nathan, all in under 5 minutes. 4 minutes too long. He moved quickly, scanning the desk for anything useful. A second backup, a hard copy, anything. Then he saw it. A locked drawer. David didn't hesitate. He grabbed a letter opener from the desk and jammed it into the lock, twisting hard. The metal groaned before finally giving way, and the drawer slid open. Inside was a stack of documents neatly bound, each page stamped with corporate seals. Financial transactions, wire transfers, names. He flipped through them quickly, his breath catching as he saw Jackson's name. Harold's, a federal account linked to a bribery investigation, and then something that made his blood run cold, Hannah's name, It was on a contract, an agreement, a transfer of legal authority. His stomach twisted. Jackson hadn't just arranged her marriage to Harold, he was selling her. David barely had time to process it before a sharp voice rang through the hallway. "Sir, this area is restricted." David's head snapped up. Security. He yanked the USB from the laptop, shoved the papers into his jacket, and moved. The door burst open just as he ducked behind the liquor cabinet, pressing himself against the shadows. 2 guards stepped inside, scanning the room. "Harold said his keycard was missing," one of them muttered. "Someone's been in here." David's pulse pounded. Too soon. He glanced toward the door, his only exit. No choice. As the guards split up, he moved, fast. He lunged toward the first guard, grabbing his wrist and twisting the gun from his grip in one sharp motion. A swift elbow to the temple sent the man crumpling to the ground before the second guard could react. David spun, shoving the first guard's unconscious body into the second, sending them both crashing into the bookshelf. A glass decanter shattered, liquor spilling across the floor. The second guard groaned, struggling to push the body off him. David didn't wait. He bolted for the door. The moment he hit the hallway, he saw Elliot waiting near the ballroom entrance. His eyes widened at the sight of David running. "Trouble?" David shot him a look. "What do you think?" Elliot didn't argue. He turned and started walking briskly, blending into the flow of guests, just as David slipped into the crowd behind him. Hannah was already near the exit, her expression composed, but her eyes dark with urgency. "Did you get it?" she asked under her breath. David nodded. "More than I expected." Hannah didn't press for details. Not yet. They had to get out first. David turned to Elliot. "That tunnel you mentioned." Elliot smirked. "Right this way." They moved quickly, slipping through the side corridors as chaos began to stir behind them. They had the proof. They had the leverage. Now they just had to survive long enough to use it. The night air was thick with tension as David, Hannah, and Elliot slipped through the hidden service tunnel beneath the estate. The distant hum of music and murmuring voices from the gala above them grew fainter with each step, replaced by the cold, damp stillness of the underground passage. Their footsteps echoed softly against the stone walls, the weight of everything they had stolen pressing down on them as heavily as the darkness around them. David led the way, his senses on high alert. His body was still humming with adrenaline from the close call in Harold's office. The stolen documents tucked securely inside his jacket burned against his skin like a live wire. They had everything they needed to take Jackson and Harold down, but only if they made it out alive. Elliot's voice was low but urgent. "We have to move fast. Jackson isn't going to sit back and let this happen." Hannah tightened her grip on the folds of her dress, her pulse pounding. She had always known her father was ruthless, but selling her off like a business transaction. That betrayal cut deeper than she ever imagined. But this wasn't the time for anger. Not yet. Right now, survival was the only priority. David glanced over his shoulder at her. "You good?" She met his gaze, her expression steely. "I will be when this is over." The exit was just ahead, a rusted metal door that led to the back of the estate, near the tree line. Elliot moved forward first, checking for any signs of security. The seconds stretched unbearably long until he finally exhaled. Clear. David reached for the handle, but just as his fingers wrapped around the cold metal, a gunshot rang out. Hannah gasped as the bullet ricocheted off the stone wall, missing David by inches. "Run!" Elliot shouted, shoving Hannah forward as more shots echoed through the tunnel. David spun, reaching for his own weapon as 2 security guards came rushing toward them from the far end of the passage. They must have been waiting. Jackson had planned for this. David fired twice, forcing the guards to take cover behind the stone pillars. "Go!" he barked, covering Hannah and Elliot as they pushed through the exit. The moment they stepped into the open night air, more footsteps pounded toward them from the estate grounds. The floodlights snapped on, illuminating the vast stretch of land between them and the tree line. Jackson Harrington stood on the balcony above, looking down at them like a king surveying a battlefield. "You have no idea what you've done," his voice boomed through the night. Hannah stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists. "I know exactly what I've done." Jackson's face was unreadable, but his eyes were cold. "If you leave now, you'll never be welcome back." Hannah let out a bitter laugh. "That's the first honest thing you've ever said to me." For the first time in her life, she felt no fear of him. He had no power over her anymore. David grabbed her wrist. "We have to go, now." She nodded once, and without looking back, they ran into the darkness. The night swallowed them whole as they sprinted toward the tree line, their breaths ragged, adrenaline coursing through their veins. Behind them, shouts erupted, boots pounding against the grass as Jackson's men scrambled to pursue. The estate floodlights cast long, distorted shadows over the lawn, but Hannah didn't stop running. David was at her side, his grip firm on her wrist as he led her toward the forest beyond. Elliot was just ahead, moving fast, his familiarity with the grounds keeping them from making any wrong turns. The stolen documents, the USB, everything they had fought for, everything that could destroy Jackson and Harold, was now in their hands. The first gunshot split the night air. David yanked Hannah to the side as the bullet hit the tree trunk inches from where she had been. Elliot ducked behind a fallen log, gesturing wildly. "We need to split up. We're easier targets together." David didn't like it, but he knew Elliot was right. "You take the creek route," he called back. "We'll head for the highway." Elliot hesitated for a fraction of a second, then gave a sharp nod. "Meet me at the drop point." Then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness like a ghost. Hannah's heart pounded as she and David moved in the opposite direction, weaving through the dense foliage. The forest grew darker, the canopy swallowing the moonlight, but David moved with purpose, keeping them on course. "There's an access road 1/2 mile from here," he murmured. "Nathan's waiting." They pushed forward, their feet slipping on damp leaves. Another gunshot rang out, closer this time. Hannah flinched, but David kept his grip tight on her hand, his focus only on getting her out alive. Minutes stretched like hours, but finally, the sound of an engine idling reached Hannah's ears. A black SUV was parked just off the dirt road, its headlights off. Nathan was already in the driver's seat, his expression tight with urgency. David yanked open the back door, ushering Hannah in first before climbing in after her. "Go," he ordered. Nathan didn't hesitate. He slammed his foot on the gas, the tires kicking up dirt as they sped away from the estate. Hannah's chest heaved as she leaned back against the seat, her mind racing. They had done it. They had gotten out. But this wasn't over. She turned to David, her pulse still thrumming. "We need to go public." David met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "We will. But we need to do it right. If we release this too soon, Jackson and Harold will bury it before it even reaches the headlines." Nathan nodded from the front seat. "I have contacts. People who won't be bought off. But once this gets out, you won't be safe, Hannah." Hannah exhaled, steadying herself. "I don't care." She had spent her entire life trapped under the weight of her father's expectations, playing the role of the obedient daughter while he orchestrated her future like a business deal. But now she was free, and she was about to burn everything Jackson Harrington had built to the ground. 3 weeks later, the world watched as the Harrington empire crumbled. The front pages of every major newspaper and news site ran the same explosive headline, "Exclusive: Millionaire business tycoons exposed in international money laundering scandal." Jackson Harrington and Harold Montgomery had been arrested in the early hours of the morning. The documents David, Hannah, and Elliot had risked everything to obtain had been irrefutable. Federal investigators had launched a full-scale probe, unearthing decades of corruption, fraud, and backdoor deals that implicated not only Jackson and Harold, but an entire network of powerful elites. Hannah stood in front of the television in her small temporary apartment, watching as the camera feeds showed her father being led into a black SUV, his face stony but devoid of its usual arrogance. The man who had controlled her entire life was now powerless. A part of her had expected to feel satisfaction, but what she felt was relief. She was no longer under his shadow. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned, opening it to find David standing there, hands in his pockets, a small smirk on his lips. "Guessing you saw the news," he said. Hannah let out a soft laugh. "Hard to miss." He stepped inside, leaning against the counter. "Elliot's safe. He's keeping a low profile, but he wanted you to know that he's proud of you." Hannah swallowed the lump in her throat. "I wouldn't have done this without him, or without you." David shrugged, but there was warmth in his eyes. "You were always going to win this fight, Hannah. You just needed the right weapons." She exhaled, her shoulders finally relaxing. "So, what now?" David studied her for a moment before replying, his voice softer. "Now you get to choose." For the first time in her life, her future belonged to her, and she wasn't afraid to step into it.